look at The Traveler by Matthews Effects. It's fascinating that mono reverb can be a brand's calling card. Matthews Effects is one of those brands that before I had used any of their stuff, I was aware of them because of their reverb pedals. They are a company that has made well-loved reverbs for years now, and in certain corners of the internet, they are the gold standard for the people that love them. Matthews Effects has always kind of taken a pretty simplistic approach to their effect design. Simple configurations, great sounds with not a lot of kind of menu diving or sub-menu controls or any of that chaos. It's always been very straightforward and very great sounds, easily attained. And we're here today to talk about a very meaningful step forward in that Matthews lineage. This is the Traveler, a simplistic, straightforward, easy to use mono reverb with MIDI. This is an incredibly easy to use and easy to understand pedal. You have your mix, your M control, which is going to be mode dependent, and your feedback, which is going to be your delay trails. Underneath, you have a single 3-position switch that jumps between mod, shimmer, and vintage, and a bypass switch. On the side here, you have your MIDI jack, and that is going to be how you control everything in this pedal, as well as recall presets. And fans of Matthews reverbs are going to love this, and new people to Matthews Effects might also love this because the sounds in here are really good. That mod mode is going to be a plate reverb, really lush, and that M control is going to be your modulation. The center position is a big washy hall reverb with an adjustable shimmer, and the vintage mode is going to be a subtle, tight, and responsive spring algorithm. And that's a really creative approach to those 3 modes. You have 3 different reverb voicings with 3 different control parameters across them. It allows this thing to be incredibly straightforward, incredibly focused, but still give you a pretty wide kind of range of sounds. You can get tight, focused spring reverb for kind of like rhythm guitar parts and really kind of like understated, just tiny splash of ambience, or you can go full exploratory wall of sound with this thing, and you can jump between those things with MIDI, which is amazing. For my money in this thing, the mod mode, that plate, sounds excellent. Even when you max out the modulation, it has a wonderful shiver to it without sounding cartoonish or seasick at any point. It just offers great movement that I think stacks really well with delays in front of it. The vintage mode gives you a ton of versatility in what would otherwise be a really kind of washy pedal. And that's an interesting thing about this, and it's worth kind of noting, is there's a few drawbacks to such a simplified form factor and to some design choices made in the pedal. The key and crucial drawback is going to be the lack of tone control on 2 of the 3 algorithms, and I would argue the 2 algorithms that would benefit the most from it. The mod mode and shimmer mode are so big and so expansive that having a low pass filter would be really handy. It's worth noting that they sound great, they're well balanced, and they don't need it. But if you're running a brighter guitar and a brighter amp, you're going to be playing a balancing act with that mix to kind of tame how much treble you get out of your reverbs. Which brings me into kind of gripe I have number 2 with this pedal, which is in mod and shimmer modes, the mix taper on this is really aggressive. I think that the sweet spot, what I would consider to be the starting place for a mix, a reverb mix on this pedal, is about 9 o'clock on the mix mode over there. And even down at 9 o'clock, you are getting a really strong reverb trail present in your signal. When you get up to noon, it can only be described as solidly unity between wet and dry signals. And for those big, washy, kind of no tone control reverb sounds, that can get really big really quickly. It's worth saying, if you are doing the kind of like it says, exploratory reverb, if you're doing that big ambient soundscaping, having so much of your pedals sweep be dedicated to big, washy, reverb heavy sounds makes a lot of sense, but it's a trade-off worth considering. The interesting twist there is when you jump to that vintage mode, the feeling of that mix taper changes completely. Suddenly you can run that mix way higher without feeling like you're washing out your signal. And that might be a difference in the mix taper itself. I don't know for sure. More than likely what it is that that vintage mode is voiced so much more differently, so much more tightly, that it just perceives to be less reverb across the board. But again, the inclusion of MIDI and presets and being able to jump between those different engines makes this a really interesting value proposition for such a small, basic, easy, simple reverb pedal to take you from these massive, spacey soundscapes all the way down to tight, responsive, splashy reverbs. There's a lot of ground to cover with the Traveler. So let's get into our sound samples. Let's give those things a listen, and let's see what makes this such a versatile and wonderful little reverb. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Jennings Voyager with McNelly Chaplin humbuckers into the Origin Effects Cali 76, the Chase Bliss Cooper Effects Genloss Mark I, the Benson Preamp, the Chase Bliss Thermae, and the Matthews Traveler. Our amplifiers are going to be the Universal Audio Dream and Ruby in a stereo pair, and our dry sound, which is just going to be the compressor and the amplifiers, sounds like this. So let's start things off with that mod mode. That mix taper is pretty aggressive. So we've got our mix down at 9 o'clock, whereas our M and our feedback are both going to be at noon. The M in this context is going to be modulation, and we'll start with both of them at noon, then we'll take both of them to 0 and kind of work our way through each of them respectively. So there's a cool kind of like shuddery thing at minimum feedback on this plate reverb, which I think is a cool texture piece. As you can tell, even the kind of like modulated plate on this thing gets incredibly spacey in a very fascinating and robust way. Let's take that momentum and take it onward to the Shimmer Hall. Okay, we've taken the Thermae back out, and we are now taking a look at the Shimmer. We've got a mix back down at 9 o'clock, our M, which in this case is going to be the Shimmer blend, and our feedback back at noon. Let's give it a listen and then kind of run through some similar min-maxing of our parameters. There's a fascinating thing about the vintage mode on this as the counterbalance to mod and shimmer, being that the first two get really washy really quickly by design. It's the traveler, exploratory reverb and all that. The presence of that vintage mode really offers that significant counterbalance we talked about, but also causes you to kind of approach the control scheme differently from the other two, which is very interesting. you'll hear kind of this like 9 noon sound versus the other two becomes incredibly subtle by comparison. But as we've been going from this mode to mix up and M and feedback at minimum, you can't actually do that here because feedback at minimum on the vintage mode will offer you almost nothing in terms of discernible reverb trail. And that M needs to be maxed out to hear the reverb because it's your low filter. And if you minimize it, it goes away completely. Just for some context on the difference between these 3 modes, let's jump back to mod and we'll walk through all 3 of them as we arrive at vintage. You can hear how this kind of serves to be the strong counterweight to the kind of more washy stuff for a tighter and more focused reverb sound. I mean, that is a striking difference between the 3 of them. And just to illustrate that further, let's take that mix nice and high. So that'll be your kind of like brightest spring setting on here. Again, you take that feedback to minimum and it feels like you're just back at your normal guitar. Yeah, it's a trip. This 3rd mode is a lot more subtle and understated than the other 2 are. And like I said, I think that offers a strong counterbalance in this pedal, especially for such a simplified kind of control scheme across the entirety of the pedal. So let's jump into the MIDI side of this pedal just briefly here at the end. You can do everything you could want to do with MIDI on this thing. You have MIDI CC controls for your bypass, what engine you're on, as well as CC 0 to 127 parameter controls for mix, M, and feedback, which is incredibly helpful. You'll also have 6 onboard presets, although I will say that, in my opinion, one of the best pro tips for the traveler is to run it with 5 presets because if there is a preset present in preset number 1, every time you boot up the pedal, it boots up to that preset sound. Whereas I like starting this pedal up and having it be in live mode. And so I keep preset 1 empty so that when I turn on the pedal, when I plug in the pedal board, whatever I'm seeing from my knobs is the settings that I'm going to hear, which is, in my opinion, preferable. But from 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you can set up whatever else you want, or you can use all 5 if you have kind of a stock startup sound you always want. But I'm only using 3 for this, basically 1 from each engine. And as you can see on the MC3, we have a hall, a spring, and a plate. So we have our live mode. In my opinion, a pedal like this, a super simple 3-knob reverb with 3 modes, the presence of those preset recalls is kind of like the most crucial MIDI implementation piece, but the presence of MIDI CC controls for everything on here is incredibly helpful as well. And let's take a look at why. Okay, so we've set up a kind of giant shimmer style reverb, but with no shimmer, you'll hear. But on our MC3, what we have set up right now is a waveform generator. We can tap in a tempo and then press start. And what that will do is send a sine wave that ramps the M control digitally from 0 to maximum and back again, basically allowing the shimmer to either rapidly or slowly or synced up with the rest of your time-based devices, kind of swell the shimmer in and out of your wet signal. And let's give that a listen.